tonight we have, as I mentioned, Claudia Bernardi, who is an extraordinary visual artist from Buenos Aires. She's going to be showing some of her work which focuses on human rights violations in Latin America. Claudia is an installation artist and printmaker whose artwork has impacted by war and the post-war period. Her work has had a large impact on numerous communities throughout Latin America. In El Salvador, Claudia created the School of Art and Open Studio of Perquín, a community-based art project where children, youth, and adults work collaboratively. Currently, Bernardi works as a professor at the California College of Arts, where she designs classes on art and human rights in Latin America. She will be joined tonight by author Mark Danner, who is going to respond, as I mentioned. Mark was a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker and is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. His work has appeared in Harper's, The New York Times, Aperture, and many other newspapers and magazines. His work is largely about war and conflict, and for over 25 years he's covered war stories in Central America, Haiti, the Balkans, Iraq, and the Middle East, among other places. Over the years he has received numerous honors, including a National Magazine Award, 3 overseas press awards, and an Emmy. In 1999, Danner was named a MacArthur Fellow, so he can take us all on together.
You never mentioned that.
And I hope you picked up this little pamphlet on your way in, and that you'll join us for some of the other works that we're going to be, expanded working groups that we're going to be offering throughout the week. Welcome, Claudia. And we know it's hot in here, and we're taking care of it.
Let's see, technicality first. Is this fine? Yes? Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. Good evening, and thank you, Anna, for the introduction, and thank you, Mark, for being here. We have been friends for many years, it seems, right? So it's great to be together to continue thinking about bodies on the line, and I very much dearly appreciate the participation of all the other fellows and friends of fellows who have been part of the different groups that we have formed so far. It has been an intense day and a half. It's not even the second day, but I think we are all left with the feeling that what precedes us seems to have a location in what we are creating right now together, which is in part, without knowing that, in part that was the thought of this presentation. It is called Shaliha. Shaliha is a word, Kikchi word. Kikchi is one of the indigenous languages in Guatemala, and we are going to visit Guatemala at the end of this conversation. Now, Shaliha, apart from being rivers that meet, which relates to topography, relates to the way they see the land, they see the water, it is also a metaphor of people coming together and bodies working communally. So this is the preambulus to this presentation. When thinking about rivers and thoughts about water, I ask them, what is rivers for you? What is waters for you? So they talk to me about rivers of tears and rivers of words. They also talk to me about this Rash Halan Halan, which in Kikchi means waters that are always changing, that are always of different greens. Before we go to Guatemala, I would like to focus on El Salvador. Briefly, Anna mentioned that my work currently is taking part in El Salvador, and it is true. I have been working in El Salvador and living in El Salvador since 2005, an average of about 4 to 6 months. But what brought me to El Salvador the first time in 1992 was a particular episode, which Mark was also part of, which had to do with the ending of the war. Now, I trust that most of us in this audience knows that there was a war in El Salvador that lasted for 12 years, a civil war that partitioned the country severely and left the country in a tragic outcome. At the end of the war in 1992, the two parts of the war, meaning the Salvadorian army and the guerrilla army, or the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí Liberation National Front, agreed upon the creation of a peace accord, first of all, and they also agree in the welcoming of the international community in the form of the United Nations. The United Nations participated in the peace process, and as part of the peace process agreement, there was the suggestion and then the outcome of investigations of violations of human rights that had been perpetrated against civilian population. One of the many massacres in El Salvador and in Morazán is the massacre at El Mozote. And the case was taken by the Truth Commission, again, sadly, not because it is the only one, but because it contained a number of very, in legal terms, paradigmatic aspects, one of which is that there was only one survivor to this massacre. Her name was Rufina Amaya Marquez. And the whole case of investigation was built on that particular testimony. So what Rufina says in her original testimony is that in December of 1981, the Atlacatl Battalion, which was an elite battalion from the Salvadorian army, came to El Mozote and divided men, women, and children and proceeded to kill everyone. The reason for which Rufina survived is very moving and very unique, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. What is important in the case of investigation is, again, that the whole case is open on her testimony. This is a photograph taken by Susan Meiselas days after the massacre. When the peace accords were signed, the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team was nominated by the United Nations to be the international team that would investigate this particular case, that would carry on an exhumation on the site. That is how the Argentine forensic team arrived first to El Salvador in September, late August, early September of 1992. And although I am not a scientist, I should remark this emphatically. I'm not a scientist, but I had worked before and after El Mozote with the Argentine team in the production of the archaeological maps. This was before computers had programs. That was the time in which we would measure depth and locations through centimeters and pendulous of weight to understand the topography of the many layers that are being revealed in an exhumation. So this is the place at El Mozote the very first day we arrived. Now, before our arrival, the whole location was divided in 9 archaeological sites. From the point of view of the investigation, the whole case was the place of crime, the scene of the crime, and it was divided for logistics reasons in 9 archaeological sites. The judge pertinent in the case decided that the first location to exhume was going to be a small building located adjacent to the church, which was called the convent, and was called the convent because that was a small place in which the priest would come to town and change garments before giving mass. So it's not a convent in a traditional form. Roughly was about 35 square meters. It's about 5 meters by 7 meters. According to the testimony provided by Rufina Amaya, so Rufina survives because she is in hiding for a period of time during the massacre. So she is in front of the church for a period of time, and then she is being taken out to be killed in the last group of women. and she's carrying her daughter at the time, and in the struggle of this scenario in which Rufina is holding her child and a soldier is taking the child away, in this struggle where the child actually is being killed, Rufina falls on the ground, and that's how she's able to move away and hide away. So for 2 days of the massacre, lasting about 3 days in total, she is in hiding. So she hears, but she doesn't see. What she sees when she is in front of the church, in front of this particular building, she sees men and male teenagers coming out of the church. And for reasons she doesn't understand, what is the criteria? Some of those men and teenagers are being killed, including her own husband. Some others are being taken inside the building. So according to the testimony of Rufina, what she saw inside the building are men and male teenagers. That is what the Argentine forensic team was thinking we were going to find. As I said, the exhumation started in September, October of 1992. And shortly after we removed the original tiles, we actually started seeing a lot of human remains, the presence of human remains. From the very early days of this exhumation, there appeared to be a discrepancy between what Rufina said and what we were finding. One of which was a larger number of deaths, a larger number of human remains. The other very disturbing evidence, even before transporting the human remains to the laboratory, is that even looking at the scale, we were looking at the presence of much younger people that Rufina described. The exhumation lasted about 2 months and a half, and from all those days, the Argentine team collected, without exception, an average of 3 to 7 to 10 human remains every day.
Could you speak up just a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
The associated garments or associated objects found at the site were also pointing out to the fact that the people inside the building were young people, were children. The garments that we found, the size of the garments and the quality of the garments were also showing that this was a place in which the majority of people taken inside the building had been much younger than what Rufina had said. So what you're looking at here is the official report presented by the Argentine team to the United Nations and to the government of El Salvador. And it states that we have identified the presence of 143 skeletal remains, including 131 children under the age of 12, 5 teenagers and 7 adults. The Argentine team was not allowed to continue this exhumation. It took many years until the Argentine team could come back to this same site known as El Mozote and continue exhumations. Now, the exhumations were not done as part of a criminal case. They were part of a civil case, just to retrieve the human remains and give back the human remains to the families and to the communities for proper burial. And we can talk a lot about the questionable process of law in El Salvador. And we can also talk about the failures and the successes, but especially the failures of the peace accords, but that will take us away from the presentation today. But I am welcoming those questions for the ones who stay during the week or the ones who would like to speak about this further. As I said before, I am a visual artist. I'm not a scientist. So what I can say about the experience of El Mozote is that it seems to me that it marks a difference between everything that happened before El Mozote and everything that has happened since El Mozote. My art changed profoundly. The reason for which I do art changed profoundly. The way I think about history and politics change. And perhaps because I am an artist, when I feel confused, I look into poetry for some assistance or solace. And this is a poem that for me was and it is very important, by Czesław Miłosz. It speaks about angels and talks about believing in them. But it is this last group of verses that inspire me profoundly. Day draws near, another one. Do what you can. And what is what I can do? ¿Qué puedo hacer yo? I really didn't know. Certainly art was a way in which the experiences at El Mozote found a home. A lot of my work that until El Mozote was timidly reaching into installation work became a new vocabulary, and a lot of the work became installation. And I suspect it is because in the modifying of the space, beyond what the piece talks about, there was something very important about modifying a given space. It felt to me that had a lot in common with the perception of the space of the mass grave itself, what we thought we were going to find, what we actually found, how that modified the way in which the history was being rewritten. So installation became a new vocabulary. Video installation was part of, I would say, the expansion of the vocabulary. These video installations that I have created up until so far recovers sound sculpture from Morazán and from the area where we live, and also all the images are vernacular to the area. So it seems to me a way in which Morazán is speaking through the artist. It's really not the artist speaking about El Mozote or Morazán. But then something perhaps more important for me than my own artwork started happening, which is that since 1992 until now, I've been to El Salvador every year, and most frequently I stay in a community called Perquín. Perquín is located 4 kilometers north from where the massacre place of El Mozote once took place. Today in Perquín, we are living in a community where ex-commanders of the FMLN live there, ex-military personnel live there, survivors of massacres live there, and very possibly the people who carry on the massacres live there, and everyone else, including the children of them all. So because I have been in contact with this community regularly for so many years, at one point it came to me as an invitation from the mayor of the town. Literally, what she said was the following. We have seen the enormous importance of art in our community, because every time I went, I did some kind of artwork with the children mostly, but then expanded to elderly and the adults. So the mayor said, we have seen the enormous impact of art in our community. How can we make the insertion of art a constant in our community? Why don't you come to create an art school? And I thought that was a fabulous proposal. And it's very rare for artists working in communities. Usually it is the artist who has to convince the community that art is a good idea. This time the community was inviting the artist to do something. So I responded to the invitation, and I went back to create, together with the community, the School of Art and Open Studio of Perquín, which is a collaborative and community-based art project. It started in 2005, and I think if I were to highlight the most important success for me, I would say that the most important success of this project is that the school is being run today by 4 local artists. I go in and out of Perquín, as I said before. I go every year for 3, 4, 5 months. But the school continues in the hands of 4 local people who 5 years ago had never seen art, have never done art. And today they are wonderful teachers, wonderful artists, and administrators. That is part of the sustainability of this project that has to work. We always say that our work is political, but it's not partisan. And this catchy phrase is actually very potent because we have all these political tensions. We had to establish our presence by saying here everyone is welcome, and we are focusing on the children, we are focusing on historic memory, we are not taking sides. In a post-war scenario, this is nothing short from a miracle, quite frankly. All the credit to the people of Perquín, who continues to see art as a tool for diplomacy. So we have painting classes for children, and we have mural painting for children and adults. We have wood sculpture classes. We have the presence of children of our community and other communities nearby. We have very popular adult classes in painting and drawing. We have printmaking. We create every project with the recognition that everything we do is the response to what the community wants, meaning we don't have a pre-set up methodology or planning. All the artworks that we create is a response to a town meeting in which people do tell us what do they want. And most importantly, perhaps, is why do they want it? So these are beautiful pictures, and I could tell a whole story about each of the projects. All of these projects have in common that when they were created, they were not created in agreement with all the parts of the community. In fact, all the projects were created with some kind of tension. And one of the tensions that I would like to highlight in this presentation is going back to El Mozote in 2006, when we were commemorating the 25th year anniversary since the massacre. I was told that the community wanted to paint a mural, and quite frankly, I didn't think it was possible because the tensions in the community are enormous for many reasons. Most of the tensions have to do with land ownership, which we can talk about that later more extensively. To make a brief summary of how complicated the project was, I would like to tell you that in the first town meeting, we were to talk about the project. We were going to paint a huge mural on the new built church, a built church after the war. It's about 55 feet long by, I think, 25 feet high, so it's a very big proportion. Half of the community wanted to paint the massacre, and the rest of the half of the community refused to accept that the massacre had occurred. So this was already a quite unbenevolent beginning for a community project, and it took us a long time and a lot of conversations with the elderly, with the youth, with the children, and trying to find out what the community had in common. And they finally came back to the recognition that they wanted to paint a mural about how El Mozote was like before the massacre had occurred. So even the ones who refused to talk about the massacre had to accept it to a certain extent. So what you're looking at is the development of this incredible mural, which we couldn't actually photograph together because we have trees, but you're seeing it in parts. Very importantly, one of the men who was the most active voice against the mural is the one who came up with the drawings, and then he transported the image on the wall of these 2 buildings. These are the 2 original buildings of the church and the convent that we exhumed. And so, it was very interesting to see that. The recommendations of the Argentine team were very clear about not touching anything from the location of the place where we had exhumed. However, there has been a lot of modification of the original building. At the end of these 25 years, the only part that survived from the original building is this part of the floor, of the original floor. Part of the 2005-2006 planning of how El Mozote was going to be remembered was to decide whether or not this floor was going to be preserved. And again, the communities, some wanted to remove the tiles, some wanted to preserve it, but finally they agreed. They agreed about creating a garden and creating a public art project, which interestingly is very similar to the actual exhumation site when we were exhuming. You know, the perimetral area shows the perimetral building as we found it at the time of the exhumation. And these are children of El Mozote today, children of the same age that we work today in art are the same age of the children that we exhumed in 1992. So in a personal journey, I have to say that it's an incredible gift of enormous proportions to be able to go back to that place and work in art with children of the same age. There's something, this poetic justice in it. And we have talked a lot in our gatherings so far about transformation. And I think this is one aspect of transformation that is possible because there is a whole community wanting to be part of it. So the project in El Salvador, the School of Art, has been named the Perquín model. I didn't name it, but it was interesting that the project in El Salvador was called, and it is being known now as the Perquín model. It is known that way because the same way we work with in El Salvador has been replicated in many other locations in Latin America and in Serbia and in Northern Ireland. In Guatemala, we have worked with survivors of massacres, survivors of torture, women who are survivors of sexual violence, indigenous women who are survivors of sexual slavery. We have worked with the community of survivors of violence in Cocorná, Medellín, in Colombia. What all these places have in common is a tragic history of violations of human rights and a group of survivors that have a commitment to the next generation, especially in the remembering what happened. That's where art comes as a tool to produce any art form that they may decide to preserve the communal memory, transporting what happened to one generation into the next one. So we are now in Guatemala, and this is an image of a less known Guatemala. Guatemala is the country that suffered a war for over 45 years. The peace accords were signed in 1996, and I am sad to inform that the violence in Guatemala is as active today as during the time of war in most regions in the northwestern area, in the northeastern area as well. The Argentine forensic anthropology team conducted an exhumation in the north part of Guatemala called El Petén in 1995, and this is the exhumation. What you're going to look at is the exhumation of the community of the 2 R's. Very similarly to what we saw in El Salvador, exactly 1 year after El Mozote, December of 1982, the Caibiles, which is an elite battalion from Guatemala, came to the community of the 2 R's and again divided men, women, and children and proceeded to kill everyone. According to the testimony of the few survivors, they said that the children were taken to the building that was used as the school, and the children were left to be murdered last They were taken close to this area you're looking at. We are in the land area of a family called Arevalo. The family Arevalo they were building a well at the time of the massacre. The well had not reached the source of water yet. The survivors said that the children were taken from the school very close to this area, and it is in this location where all of them were killed and thrown into the well. So the exhumation that took place in 1995 was the exhumation to go inside the well, which very rapidly we understood we couldn't go in the traditional format of just putting a cord and going down, because the adjacent areas of the well were collapsing on top of us. So we had to open a large adjacent area to make the entrance safe. And after 2 months of doing that, we actually arrived to the original area, the top area of the well, and we started finding what the survivors had indicated. A total of 165 human remains belonging to people who at the time of death was plus minus 12 years of age, with an average age of 7 years of age. The human remains were given to the community for burial. Uncannily, not that long ago, a friend of mine, dear friend of mine, Mimi Doretti, member of the Argentine forensic team, sent me this image, which also became part of the report. This is an image taken by a pass-buyer in the community of the 2 R's very shortly before the massacre had occurred. These are the children of the community of the 2 R's, the ones probably that we exhume. So this brings me, and I think us, in many conversations, to the question of power. What is power? What kind of power are we talking about? Human power, crowds and power. This is a quote by Pilar Calveiro, who is a writer, thinker from Argentina, who wrote a book called Power and Disappearances. Weapons are potentially maddening. They are created to kill, thus providing the illusion of having control over life and death. We are now in the northeastern part of Guatemala, in Alta Verapaz. In June, July of this year, the School of Art and Open Studio of Perquín were invited to come to Alta Verapaz, to a place called Panzos in Alta Verapaz, to work with 75 men, women, and youth, all indigenous Kekchi people, who are survivors of the massacre of Panzos that took place on May 29th of 1978. The woman on the photograph is Mama Maquin. The woman on the left is Maria Maquin, is the granddaughter of Mama Maquin. The massacre at Panzos took place, again, for issues related to land and land ownership. Mama Maquin was a lideresa, they say in Spanish, of the community. So she went on that morning of 29th of May of 1978 to request for the land. She went with a certificate, and she also went with her granddaughter, Maria. The massacre occurred. Mama Maquin was one of the first to be killed. She fell over Maria Maquin. Maria was 11 years old at the time, and she played dead, and she survived, she escaped, and she was one of the members of this group of artists in Alta Verapaz in June, July of this year. We are invited to work in Guatemala. We have been invited to work in Guatemala many times by a local human rights organization called ECAP, Equipo Comunitario de Acción Psicosocial, which stands for Psychosocial Community Team. The mandate of ECAP is to accompany survivors of state terror in many different capacities, as legal advisors, as psychosocial workers. They also help them relocate. And this is very important because what happened subsequent to the massacre of Panzós is that, well, first of all, the massacre of Panzós is not the last, but actually the first of many other massacres that took place in the same area. The survivors of the massacre of Panzós and many other communities, imagining that the army were coming after them, escaped to what is called Sierra de las Minas. It's a mountain range. It's about maybe 200 miles from Panzós. It is known to be impenetrable. And it is in that location where the communities lived and survived for 30 years. Some of the people we worked with in June, July had left the mountains for the first time only 3 months before the art project. Although, as I said, the peace accords were signed in 1976, the political scenario of Guatemala is very frail, and people felt, rightly so, very insecure about coming out of Sierra de las Minas. The project in Panzós is similar to any other project that we create community. We first gather and the question is produced, what is what you want? And why do you want it? Then furthermore, we ask where, if this is going to be a mural, where is the mural going to be located? And is this going to be a mural to be shown to the community or needs to be protected, needs to be preserved for small groups? All those are decisions that the community themselves take. In this case and in every case we have worked. In this particular case, the community chose, and they were allowed, they were given permission to create the mural in the communal house. So if you were to think about this setting as the square, we have here the municipality, here is the cultural hall, and there is the church. It is from these buildings where the army shot at all the people that were gathered in the square. So we were painting in the cultural house, in la casa comunal, the communal house, and literally beyond the wall is where the massacre occurred. So a lot of the conversations that the people share was where they were located at the time of the massacre. That was the beginning of the conversation. In this project and in any other one, we start by remembering together what happened and always presenting the question, what is what you want to say? What are your memories? We go through drawings. Everyone draws, everyone looks at everyone's drawings, and then there is a selection process that is being done by themselves, trying to figure out from all that is being said, what is the most prominent. And then we go to the actual wall that frequently is pre-prepared. In this case, it's a wall that was 50 meters long by almost 50 feet long by about 16 feet high. And we transport the drawings back to the actual place, and once more we converse about how are we going to make this transition. We look at the mural thinking about anchors or poles of gravity, and we think, what is the most important image of this mural? And if this is the most important image, where is this going to be located? To the right, to the left? Are we going to talk a lot about what happened in the land? Are we going to have a lot of space for the sky? What is the decision process? It's very fascinating to hear and to accompany all these conversations that in the case of Panzós was spoken a lot. Now, we have to understand, and I share this with you, that all these people had survived in the Sierra de las Minas only because they had a very strong community awareness, a community, the praxis of community life was needed in order to survive. So the project, the art project, was no different than collecting food, distributing it, collecting water and distributing it. In fact, the vocabulary was reaffirming of that the art project was a resemblance, in a way, of the survival skills that they have developed in Sierra de las Minas. The youngest artists were about 5 and 6 years old. So we are looking at 3 generations. We are looking at the elderly people who are the survivors of the massacres, then the adults who at the time of the massacre were about 30 to 40 years old, and then we are looking at the young people who were born in the Sierra de las Minas, who only knew about the massacre through their parents, and the children who are the children of the youth. So actually 4 generations, not 3. The way we work here and in all projects is by having the community working together at all times. And remarkably, if we think any other visual artists in this group, well, if you meet other visual artists after this conversation, talk to them about ownership of the image and competition and having your voice being heard or not. I don't know how it happens when we are not invested in the traditional learning of Western art. But my experience is that that which would make almost impossible a project of this nature in the United States or Buenos Aires, Argentina, is possible in Panzós, in Colombia, and El Salvador. People do come together and work together collectively, mostly dividing the space through scale. The children paint low. The young people who can go up in the scaffolding love to go up in the scaffolding, while the women tell them what to do and what not to do, and the men are in the middle together with the women. And here we have Romeo painting one part of the project that the women thought was very important. So every line he was making, the women were there to watch it, to see if this was a good move or not. And here we have Maria Ba, Rosario, and Maria Pop, 3 wonderful women artists. Scaffolding. And here we have 3 young men who were left with a very, very difficult task of painting Mama Makin under the surveillance of Maria Makin, the granddaughter. So Maria Makin and Mama Makin were the anchor of this place, of this mural. Mama Makin was the most important part of the mural, as they thought it should be, because of what she embodies. And they didn't want to make her dead. They wanted to make her alive. And in fact, they decided that the presence of Mama Makin was dividing the past from the present in the mural. It took about a week and a half to go from a white wall to a beautiful, beautiful mural. And at one point I said to them, I think we are finished. Let's take a step back and let's see what we have done. And we did. We all stepped back, and these are some images of them looking at the mural for the first time, seeing it all. And this is what we saw. We saw the beginning of the mural from right to left. The right part is the memories of how they remember the area when they were children. A very important part in this area, and again we can talk about that later, is that in this area of Panzós is where the train rail of the United Fruit Company was first built. That is why the origin of land ownership became such a conflictive reality in this area, because for the United Fruit Company to create the railroad, they had to literally remove all the indigenous communities that were living there. So one of the first memories the people had was the beginning of the railroad, and how the first formation of the railroads coincide with the memories of the first aggressions against the civilian communities in the area of Panzós. And then the area moves, the mural moves towards the left part, and you are already presented with the first images of war and the first images of violence against communities. Violence they never understood why was happening. Maria Pop painted her husband as the image to the right, and there are many, many stories. I wish I had the time or actually the capacity to translate, but the case of Maria in a way is symbolic in that not only she saw her husband being hanged, after the man died, the army took him down and obliged Maria to cut him into pieces. She had to cut it into pieces, which she did, and her biggest sorrow is that she couldn't find all the pieces for burial. Until today, she's hoping to find some. This is the actual painting of the massacre, including the presence of a local woman whose role was to kill the children who survived the death of their mother. So this woman, Eulalia, who still lives in Panzós, actually, was part of the army. She was a Ladina, she was not indigenous. So the army gave her the task to collect the children that had survived the death of their mothers, and her role was to kill the children. Mama Makin, right here in the middle, separating the past with all these tragic memories from the present and the future. So her image, and you see she still has the certificate in the hand, right? And towards my Mama Kin's right, we have the present and the beginning of a possible future. And here's one of our translators, Matilde Cal, who said she was going to be the first woman to take a photograph in front of Mama Makin, but we had all the women taking a photograph in front of Mama Makin. And this is the mural completed. These are these artists from Panzós. Unbeknownst to me at the beginning, and I think was good, when we presented the mural to the community, when we opened the place for the community, some of the members of local politics that came, we learned that they were the responsibles of the massacre. They had actually been part of the massacre. So the local minister of culture and the mayor, they are directly connected to the massacre. So when we learned that, I really didn't know how to handle this, but I talked to the participants and said, what do you want to do? So Emilio Cucul said, I want to talk to them. I want to tell them what happened to us looking at the mural. So because you have this in English, I will read this in Spanish. A nosotros nos desprecian. Siempre nos han despreciado, sin siquiera conocernos. En este mural volvemos a sentir que valemos la pena, que no tienen por qué matarnos. And Don Roberto Morán looked at them and said, lo que hemos pintado es la verdad. They speak to me about Sirtaqua. It's the opposites that govern the universe, earth and valleys, highs and low, woman and man. They also talk about rivers. They run across and along many lands. They adapt to the path of least resistance, working with the power of the earth and the power of water. What I learned from them is that in Mayan cosmogony, the colors of corn represent the colors of life. Red is the birth of the day, yellow is wind, white is water, black is the end of the day. Life, death, transition, and survival. Shaliha are the rivers that meet ever fluent forces that undulate. They speak about this moving liquid snake that meets and gathers. Rivers is life. We, like rivers, are reaching one another at this time. Power is to know that this is true. Thank you.
It is an honor to be here, an honor to be here at Bodies on the Line. And thank you to Anna DeVere Smith and to the Mellon Foundation, and most of all to Claudia Bernardi, who has been part of my life for a long time, and who I met standing at one of the scenes that was pictured in her presentation at El Mozote. I had traveled up there as a writer for the New Yorker magazine. I remember that I was a fairly young writer for the New Yorker magazine, and I felt increasing trepidation as I approached, because this was the scene of an exhumation of a mass killing that had been notorious for many, many years. It had been known about in the United States and fought about in our politics within 6 weeks of its occurrence. And the American government denied that it had happened, though the embassy and the third secretary at the embassy and others on the ground knew essentially that it had happened. And finally, a full 11 years later, the exhumation was happening, an exhumation of nearly 1,000 dead, probably the largest massacre in modern Latin American history. And I remember very well feeling a kind of fear and foreboding as I approached, going up into the mountains of Morazan. Is there a way to get back to one of your slides, or easily? Sure. I just want to show the map.
We're going to start again.
We're talking about borders.
What is what you want?
Go back to I guess just the map of Salvador. We're talking about borders, and one of the significances of the killing at El Mozote. Yeah, just that one. Yeah. Is that it happened.
Yay!
Huxai and Mount Fuji.
Computer person here in.
Well, it needn't disrupt us. I'm sorry I asked for it. But one of the great significances of El Mozote was the site lies near the border, the political border between Salvador and Honduras. Oops. Okay. That's Susan Mycelis's photographs. There we go. Over here in the mountains. And in the larger context of the Salvadoran Civil War, the guerrilla forces of the FMLN took refuge over that border in Honduras. You can turn it off if it's going to keep doing that.
I think
the guerrilla forces of the FMLN took refuge over the border in Honduras, and army operations of the American-advised and American-trained Salvadoran army were concentrated in those mountains. And in fact, at the time the massacre happened, right after Ronald Reagan took power, also not a coincidence, there was a great deal of killing up in those mountains because the guerrillas, the FMLN, looked like it might indeed be able to seize that part of the country, and that some countries, notably France and Mexico, might recognize Morazan as a separate country, which would have been a catastrophe in the context of the Civil War. In any event, I was on my way there 11 years later, feeling trepidation about what I would find, wondering what the story would be like. And when I finally arrived at the site, I found this very strange atmosphere of horrible images, some of which you've seen, of bodies or skeletons, rather, actually bunches of clothes, because they were very small, because the great majority, overwhelming majority at that particular site were children, as Claudia has described to you. And then floating over it all, the Argentine forensic team, who were these young, wonderful Argentine women, who, and you know, it was in a funny way like a mythological scene in some way, as if they were angels, angels of death, and also angels of life, I should say, because one of the things they were doing is giving voice, and we talk about power and truth, but they were taking things that were inanimate objects that were actually denied, their existence was denied by both the Salvadoran government, the Salvadoran elite, and the American government. And they were showing that, first and foremost, these existed. These people had been killed, 1,000 of them. And it bears saying, I think, that this massacre, the photographs you saw from Susan Meiselas, were taken 6 weeks after the massacre happened. So we're immediately confronted, I think, with a question, which is, first of all, how do you get from, and again, another border, from denial to fact, to establish fact? And the second transit, difficult transit, is from fact to truth, another very difficult border. We were caught during that exhumation, still caught between denial and fact. And what Claudia had to say about the attitudes within Perquín about doing a mural that would actually commemorate the massacre, and the fact that half of the people in the town still deny that it exists, is, I think, indicative of something very real, that you can give evidence, you can show, but what does it mean to establish something as a truth? This is, it seems to me, an extremely vital question for our society, among others. I've been writing a lot in the last 7 or 8 years about torture, something that is a fact, and that indeed the government of the United States, Department of Justice, Department of Defense, other reports have shown quite clearly as a fact, but for the country it is not yet a truth. It's not yet a truth. The question is, it seems to me, the one that's raised vividly by Claudia's talk, is how do you get from fact, that is, from those bodies, to truth? And I would argue that truth has not yet been arrived at in either Salvador or Guatemala, and that striking mural in Panzos with Mama Maquin holding out, I wish I could call the image up, but I won't try, holding out that letter is in essence a plea for truth. And it says something, it seems to me, very vital. She is depicted, though she was killed and was the most prominent member, if one can speak in those terms, of that township who was killed. And though arguably it was what the plea she made that in some way catalyzed that killing, she is depicted as alive and holding symbols, very powerful cultural symbols in a basket, and holding out the letter, which is a plea for land, first and foremost, and secondly, justice. And justice is presented as outside of time and space, as something that is going to be constant, real, inextinguishable. It will stay there, just as she remains, as depicted, in essence, still living and still alive, because the claim on justice is still alive. I should say that my first image of Claudia at the El Mozote massacre site was of her standing on the edge of this exhumation with a sketch pad in front of her, drawing. And I remember this absolutely vividly, as several of these other photographs. So Claudia's job was to depict the disposition of the bodies, to make of this complete tangle and chaos of death some kind of conceivable and understandable spatial arrangement that you could look at. And the way she tackled this was to do drawings that were kind of beautiful, extraordinarily elegant. I wish you had slides of these stick figures, essentially. These beautiful, that showed the disposition of bodies, and they were done on vellum, or the equivalent, tracing paper, layer after layer. So showing each layer of these tangled, tiny, mostly, bodies. There were some adults, but very few. So you had these layers, one after another. I think there were 7 or 9? 7. 7, depicting 143 total bodies, which is a seventh of the total of those killed at El Mozote. And then on the bottom was a depiction of where the bullets were found in the floor of El Convento, which is really the vestiary, right? It's not really convent, as you said. So the bullets were depicted very precisely, the bullet holes, the slugs that had been found in the floor. And when you put all of these together, one piece of vellum on top of another, with the bullets on the bottom, something quite miraculous happened, which is these depictions were transformed from depictions into a kind of truth, because they showed, with the bullets in the floor, that the claims that had been made for many years, then 11 years, about El Mozote, first of all, that it had never happened. Secondly, that it was actually guerrillas who had been killed in the war, were disproved in the act of that art making. In other words, those bullets showing through those layers of vellum showed that those people were killed, or at least were shot again, which is probably more likely what happened, as they were lying in a heap in this convent. So that very act of depiction proved something by itself, without even the Argentine forensic report. And I remember looking at that for the first time and thinking, oh my God, that is a miraculous thing, because you don't need to be told anything. It shows you. And this massacre had been discussed in front of Congress, denied, discussed by Assistant Secretary of State, denied, mentioned by the President, Reagan, denied. Suddenly, in the act of looking at those layers, it was proven. Bam. So, step one toward fact. How do you take that step and second step towards truth? I think this is where Claudia and I diverge, and where our lives since El Mozote, in effect, have taken a different path. I've gone on to report on other wars, and I've never returned. I went after I did this long piece for the New Yorker. It became a book, The Massacre of El Mozote, which described how this happened. But I have never returned for any of the anniversaries or for the death of Rufina Amaya, the single witness who she mentioned. Claudia has done something very different. And I think this is another border, which is the border between art and action, art and talking, between speech and silence. There are a number of ways I think we could depict it, but the Perquín model, as others have called it, clearly is about that border and trying to cross that border. I have a quote that really struck me about the Panzos project, but it could be true of El Mozote as well. The mural would be a book of history that would narrate a different story than the personal testimonies that they had given to human rights agencies. This is about the Panzos massacre. The book of history would contain personal stories that could be rendered as a community effort in which the memories of one person would merge, engage, accompany, become the memories of everyone. So individual memories are transformed through the act of painting, drawing, but more than anything else, collaborating, the discussions about what had happened, the exchange of personal stories that come together in a kind of river to make one story. and that also serve as a way to articulate what actually happened and also what can happen in the future. I mean, look, in Pansos, it seems to me, just looking, I have not been there or reported on it, but it seemed to me so striking, the narrative toward truth that was contained in that mural. That is, it began in the 1870s, I think late 1870s when the railroad came, through a plot line that is very familiar through much of Central America. Railroad, United Fruit, extraction, exploitation, and then an attack on land holdings, that is small holdings. I think that we as Americans, maybe, I think this is not true of Argentines, but as Americans we are almost imbued with a Whiggish view of history, as the British call it, which is that we want to believe that things get better. The word underdeveloped is an indication of that. They're behind us, they're underdeveloped. But in fact, history doesn't work that way, and Central America is a great demonstration of that. We have so-called progress, and then we have a ripping away, a tearing away of property, of rights. And the 1920s, 1930s, in Salvador as in Guatemala, were a time when land that had been for generations small holdings and had given people their income was seized by the powerful. Next door in Salvador, you had La Matanza, famous enormous massacre that occurred during this period. But essentially you had a journey, as it were, back into a different kind of society where people had fewer and fewer rights and eventually didn't even have the right to, or the power to, raise their own food and became something little more than slaves. This is, it seems to me, what this massacre was certainly about during the 46-year civil war in Guatemala, was certainly what El Mozote was about. And the US, of course, not to make us all feel guilty, but perhaps to make us all feel more informed, had a very direct role in both of these events, as the trainer of the Atlacatl, and also as probably a watcher of that particular massacre in El Mozote, as an overthrower of probably the one positive turn in Guatemalan history, that is the Arbenz regime in 1954, which the CIA overthrew. So we are very much part of this stream of history. What I admire so much, so fervently in what Claudia told us today, and this is a very personal view because, as I say, we diverge in this. I've gone on to write about a lot of different violence, which is, of course, violence is another border between life and death, occupied by violence in all these places. And you've gone on essentially to try to heal, although that word is somewhat, I think, misleading because people don't heal from an event like El Mozote or Pansos, but in some way to integrate these events of the past into present life through art and to put at the head of this a claim for truth. And truth, it seems to me, is a very, particularly when it comes to El Salvador, Guatemala, but also when it comes to the United States, is a very elusive thing. Perhaps it's the greatest border of it all. We've been witness to the difficulty of coming to understand truth as a society, it seems to me, over the last decade or more, very vividly, and we still haven't reached it. You know, President Obama's words were looking forward, not back. And it seems to me that one of the things that Claudia has done is to show a way of looking back, of taking inanimate bones and giving them voice, taking inanimate objects and, in a sense, making them live again, taking people who had been used as means, not as ends, in the Kantian locution, and making them ends again, giving them a role and integrating them also in a living way in people's present lives. I find the whole process, frankly, rather miraculous, to tell you the truth. And I have, early on, I don't know if anyone here noticed it, but there was, in one of the early El Mozote images, where there were a lot of bones and other things, there was a little red horse on that table. And I had written early in this book about, the first day I was there, Mimi Doretti, and unfolding one of these bundles, these little bundles of bones that were this big and that had to be carefully opened and the bones taken out one by one, found in one of the pockets this little horse, just a plastic horse. And she cursed, and I didn't even know her, I don't think yet. I don't think I'd even been introduced to her. But I stiffened and understood immediately what had been the shock of this, that these bones suddenly were made into a living personality by looking at this toy. This was this little girl's toy, this little horse. Many years later, I went to a silent auction that Claudia had, which was to support actually the Perquín model, as it's now called. And there on the wall was a spectacularly beautiful and haunting painting called The Little Red Horse, if I'm not mistaken. And I bought it. Not without difficulty. Somebody put their name under mine at the last minute, as people do with silent auctions. Claudia saw me looking bereft and came over and said, "What's the matter?" And I said, they got the painting. She went over and talked to the person, and lo and behold, suddenly I had it again. So it means that I get up every day when I'm in Berkeley, in Miloš's house, another echo in this presentation, and I look at that little horse, and it reminds me not only of the death that I was trying to understand, that brought me into contact with it, but also what you can do with it, and that death is not the ending in these things. It's not the ending at all. That's a border that's, I think, quite artificial, and your work, it seems to me, shows that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps we should talk.
And I think Anna's suggestion, we should move straight to questions. So, Claudia, would you come up if we add another chair?
Thank you, Mark.
Or to take the blue line. I have a question. Mark talked about. Sure. Do I need to go? I have a question about healing. Mark said that the notion of healing is, of course, problematic in some ways. But Claudia, I wonder if you could talk a little about how the communities that you've been working with have or haven't been in some way changed or healed by the art projects.
Well, the whole, so much to speak about it. Like Mark, I have great difficulties to even pronounce the word healing when facing El Mozote or Guatemala or the disappearance in Argentina. I think in general when people talk about healing, it is the concept is being produced with great candor, perhaps, and not with ill will. But my observation and what I have observed is that to this kind of tragedy, there is no healing possible. It's almost, in a way, impolite to speak about it. It is so fragile. For me,
for you.
Yeah, for me, yes.
Right now.
I have come to think of an image that for me is very potent. And I think of this kind of tragedy as an amputation of sorts. And I think if someone would have an accident and loses a leg, no one would expect that another leg would grow up, you know, no one would. Now, with that only leg that you have, one can learn how to dance and even enjoy travel the world, but another leg will never reappear. And I think that to me is what I observe in my own life as an Argentine, having gone through the years of the military dictatorship, personally and communally, is what I see in the people in Morazan and Colombia, all these places. The tragedy is so enormous. I mean, this vignette that I share with you about Maria Pop, the way she speaks about it many years after the massacre, over 30 years after the massacre, makes her cry as if it happened yesterday, and makes me cry, not knowing, just knowing that the possibility, what it would be like if I have to go through that. So the healing, I never use the concept, I never write about it, and if I do, I will always go out of my way to explain all that I'm telling you. Now, the other side of it is that in reality, every art project that we have conducted, perhaps because it is collaboratively done and produced, creates a new platform, a new bridge, a new frontier. And I think all projects have in common that is very sad at the beginning when we first collect all the memories. It's very frequent that they cry, we cry. There is, what else can you do? I mean, what else can you do when people start talking about it? But then, and this is the miracle of art perhaps, it's celebratory. And as we were saying today in one of, I forget where, talking about Ding's work and about genocide and the other side of the spectrum, which is creativity, to be creative is very wonderful. And to be creative together brings such an amazing possibility. So we go from the first days of sharing deep sorrow to having a ball and having great time, and people laugh a lot. And you know, in this case of Panzós, we were working with interpreters. I really don't know Kekchi, I'm so sorry to say. But this is what I see art can do. Art can bring a new frontier of joy through the creation. And it's not about holding hands and the world is going to be a good one, you know. No, it's not that. It's something far more provocative. And it is similar and yet different every time we create something because the participants are different. So a vignette, again, about Panzós. I wanted to learn how to say good morning, and they told me they don't say good morning. And how do you say good afternoon? We don't say good afternoon. And how do you say good night? We never say good night. Say, what do you say? We say masala la chol, which means, do you have happiness in your heart? That's where they are concerned. And to me, this is an incredible transformation for people who have gone through so much damage to still care whether or not I have joy in my heart. And the answer was, I have a lot of joy working with you. So whether or not that is healing, I don't know. I'm open. It's not a full circle. It's an undulation.
I was very struck by the differences in the memories of the two communities. In Panzós, you have a shared narrative. It sounded as if there wasn't a lot of conflict over what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in El Mozote, there was. And the resolution was, in fact, not to get at even the facts, but rather some kind of compromise. And I just wondered how those two ways of dealing with the tragedies ultimately affected the two communities, and particularly El Mozote, and how people were able to still live together, and what was the role of the art project in perhaps moving that capacity along?
Mm-hmm. Well, you are right in seeing these two projects very differently. Pansos, everyone was the survivor of the massacre of Pansos, so they had great, acceptance of what had happened. The memories were the same, and even for the next generation, although they had not gone through it, they had learned through their parents. In El Mozote was the other way around. We had a very polarized community. So I would say that in responding to your question, one of the first achievements was just the proposal of the art project. As I said before, El Mozote is 4 kilometers south of where we are. We, members of the School of Art in Perquín, went to El Mozote many times, and they were so polarized. I finally said, call me when you can stay in the same room. And they said, well, we cannot stay in the same room. So I said, then don't call me, because we can only paint this mural when you all will be able to be in the same place. So they thought about it, and they sent a young person to say, we are all at the Casa Comunal. We are all at the communal head. Well, good start. So that for me was a very prosperous project. They have come to at least be curious enough of how this project would be. And then of course the conflict became part of the structure, So the conversations were very well, if we cannot paint the massacre and we cannot forget the massacre, what is what you are going to work with? And that took another 2 months until they came up with this idea that they all wanted to paint the mural featuring what El Mozote was before the massacre. And then it became, again, very joyous. People remember, do you remember such and such? He had this little store and he did this. And so we were collecting all these images. The older people talked to the young reinterpreted, and we had all the Casa Comunal filled with drawings. And it was in this selection of the drawing where I started seeing that the community was finding a bridge. Interestingly, one of the men who was very, very opposed to the project, another one who was very opposed, Don Florentin, who refused to be part of the meetings, ended up wanting to be part of the mural. He wanted his portrait on the mural, holding a book that says History of El Mozote. Still today, people ask me, how did you convince Don Florentin? And I didn't, but he somehow changed, and he wanted to be part of it. So that is one way in which the community really changed through the project. But most importantly, and this is to the credit exclusively to the community, I think one part is to paint the mural, and then the second one is to take care of the mural. And the place where the new garden was created needs a lot of attention, especially in the dry season, needs to be water. And it is to the credit of the community that a new committee to keep alive the monument has been created by people who are in favor and against. And something that I didn't show in the images for lack of time is that the two parts recognize the importance of having the names of the children who perish at El Mozote being recognized. So they both accepted the creation of very humble and potent ceramic tiles that name all the names of the children according to a census that exists of the community with the ages, starting at 3 months old was the youngest victim to 12 years of age. So at the very bottom part of the mural, you see all these names and these ages, and people take care of the mural.
It might be worth pointing out, just an answer, partial answer to your question, that technically speaking, El Mozote was not something made by survivors. There weren't survivors. And that is a major difference between these two things. There was only one, there's one adult and possibly one child, although that's somewhat disputed about whether indeed he's a survivor. So the people who were arguing and fighting, though some were related to those who had died and were from surrounding areas, El Mozote itself was extinguished completely, which makes writing about it difficult too. But so these were different.
Yeah.
They were in a different relationship to the violence that happened. Those at Panzos were people who had all suffered the violence and had escaped it.
And it should be said again, according, following on what Mark says, that the reason of the antagonism is directly related to land ownership, because there are no survivors. After the peace accords were signed and after the exhumation happened, people came back to El Mozote to repopulate it. This is a side effect of poverty and the enormous collapse of economy in the war, post-war process. But because there were no documents to state who owned what, it was pretty much based to first arrive, first serve, and that created enormous friction among families who said, well, Mark is the son, I am the sister of the deceased, who has more right? And so that points out again to an unfulfilled aspect of the peace accords. I think the peace accords were successful in some aspects and very unsuccessful in others, one of which very important and successful proposal is the redistribution of land, which has never really been done, and the little that has been done very wrongly and with a lot of corruption and imprudent decisions. So the El Mozote refusal to accept that the massacre occurred is not so much about the massacre, it's about, if they don't recognize that a massacre occurred, they don't have to deal with the fact that they are living in a land that doesn't belong to them.
There's actually even another aspect of this, which gets to what El Mozote was about, which, as Claudia mentioned, and as I write about a lot in my book, it's still not clear why exactly they killed these people at this point. One of the reasons, clearly, this is demonstration violence. That is, you're not trying to kill the entire countryside, you're trying to kill enough people to scare everybody else. Another example of using people as a means, not an end. But the reason those 1,000 people died was because they stayed when the army came during this large operation. Now, everyone else left, and the people who were fighting over the land and claiming it and so on, they left. They weren't there. And one of the reasons that the people in El Mozote stayed, some evidence suggests, is that their relations with the army were fairly good, that there was a significant number of evangelical Christians among them as opposed to Catholics who were not sympathetic to the guerrillas. So when this operation came in to, as it were, empty out the area of guerrillas, the people who had better relationships with the FMLN left with the FMLN. The El Mozote people stayed, thinking that their relationship with the authorities would protect them, and in fact it didn't. So there's a further irony here, which is that the people who came back and claimed the land were in effect the enemy of at the time of the government and certainly of the military, much more. The whole question of the politics in the area is very complex and fascinating. It still is, actually, but anyway. I think we've answered all their questions, apparently. Hi.
To that end, pointing on your question, Mark talked about the journey from denial to fact and in fact to truth. And I'm wondering, knowing the El Mozote community the way that you do, if you think there will ever be a mural that does honor or depict the massacre in some way, or if you think there will always be a division that exists because there's only one survivor because of the situations that surround it. And I have a second question, if I can throw that at you as well. Just based on interviews that I've read of yours and seeing your work, I'm curious as an artist, having gone down there in 1992, not as a scientist, as you said, with your forensic team, using the utensils that you use as an artist, the small brushes. You talk about being in the face of major, just a major atrocity, but also feeling some life in it, finding some light in it. And I'm just curious, if that's just who you are, if it's a conscious choice you made or discovery that came through your work as an artist, how you got there in the face of such darkness.
But the first question, whether or not there will ever be a mural depicting the massacre, I really don't know. But in a way, if I have to answer that, I would say I hope not. I hope something else will be the subject of the mural. What I can tell you is that the children are growing up very aware of what happened there. And again, in El Mozote today, there are children that are related to the survivors of the massacre and relatives of the one who perished. And there are also children that are sons and daughters of military personnel that, married women from Morazan. It's really interesting to hear the children talk about what happened. So I really cannot say, I cannot predict, but as I said, in a way, I hope not. The whole El Mozote community is in a way a place of memory. The human remains that the Argentine forensic team recovered in 1992, and the ones that were recovered later, 2000, 2001, 2, 3, and 4, all of them, all those human remains are now buried at El Mozote, and there is a monument that remembers everyone. People come from all over the world to pay homage to the people who perish at El Mozote. It's such a parable, like Marx says. It's such an incredible, potent symbol that is not only of Morazan or El Salvador, it represents Latin America, so people come constantly. What is really beautiful to hear is that now people come also to see the murals, and this I have seen. I have seen people who receive the visitors and say, we have done this. And to me, this moves me to tears. When we presented the mural to the community, and I went there early, the community, ones and the others, had taken all the benches from the church outside, and they were all watching the mural as if it was a movie. And I thought that was beautiful. So it has not been defaced, still is very well taken care of. I think that talks about the community and what they want to remember. The other question is so complicated. I really don't know what to answer. What I can tell you is that the tools I use for my art are the same tools used for the exhumation. And I was very, very aware at the time of the physicality of it all. I thought it was incredible that we were using small brushes and spoons and little tools that are exactly the same ones that I use in my art making. That was frightening. It was, I remember looking at this as if one would look at, at this thin piece of something that I don't know what it was, whether light, life, death, whatever, but it was emerging almost as a sound rather than a visual. There was something there that I could not understand. And in regards whether or not it's a personal attitude or not, I think Mark pointed out well, although we never thought about it, but yes, his journey has been so different. And I admire Mark's journey. I read his books, although they're sad, but I read them.
Thank you, Claudia.
Yeah. And I have admiration because he goes into this channel of sorrow. And for me, I think after El Mozote, there was a matter-of-factness that emerged with it, that the poem of Miloš summarizes that. What can I do? And the only thing I can do is art. I don't know how to do anything else. So for me, together with my own art, which, as I said, is hugely impacted by that, the creation of these community art projects became an answer. And Anna and I talked about this very briefly when we met in San Francisco, and I said, I think this community work is a new genre of art. I never do the work. I never paint anything. I seem to be the one person among many whose task is to help other people create. And I presume, and I know that there are many artists doing this in the world. Those are the artists that are not highlighted in Art in America, I think. And I guess it's because we work a lot, so we don't have time to talk about it. But Ding is one. I mean, a lot of the project he does in his part of the world is similar. I think we are looking at, interestingly, we are transiting the creation of a new genre in which an artist can help other people do art, and that is the art form, is their work, our vision helps others, I think.
You know, I have to add just one last image to that, because your mention of Miloš reminds me of something that he has a little beautiful paragraph in a book of his, I think it's called The Separate Notebooks, in which he talks about that phenomenon. I'm sure all of you have noticed it. You walk into a gallery, a big gallery room, like something in a room in the Met, for example, and you see far on the other end of the wall, you see a picture. It's so far away you can't tell what it's depicting. You can't tell what it's about. You can't tell anything except you know it's a Titian, or you know it's a Tintoretto, just by the way it looks. And Miloš, I've had this observation a lot, as I'm sure most people here have, and Miloš talks about that and says, you know, what this is the personality and spirit of the artist, taken away from the subject, taken away from everything that you can see because you see it at a distance. And he goes on to say that actually everyone has that. The particular privilege of the artist is being able to embody it in a form that others can see. So it seems to me that one of the things that Claudia is doing in the Perquín model, among other things, is bringing that ability to embody something that others can see to a great many people who have been injured, have lost terribly, but have something to tell the world and to tell themselves. And it seems to me if this is a new genre, that's the genre. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you both very much, and I guess I'll leave us with one haunting idea, because earlier today, when we were looking at Dean's wonderful exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, and what is the name of it so I can plug it?
It's Project 93, but the title is The Farmers and the Helicopters.
The Farmers and the Helicopters, right now at the Museum of Modern Art. You suggested that art and genocide are kind of counterpuntal.
Mm-hmm.
And when we tried to imagine that today, we couldn't imagine art really speaking up to genocide. If you're thinking about the instruments of exhuming being the same as the instruments that you paint with, perhaps as we continue our conversation this week, we should worry about what Audre Lorde told us in the 80s and 90s, much repeated, that we can't possibly take down the master's house with the master's tools. So to be continued tomorrow, and thank you both so much for a really glorious talk. Thank you.
Thank you.